The Henderson family had been looking forward to this day for weeks. It wasn't just any party. It was a celebration of their youngest son, Marcus, who had just graduated from high school with honors. Family and friends gathered in the backyard, laughter and music filling the air as they congratulated Marcus on his achievement. The sun was bright, casting a golden glow over the lawn where kids ran around, playing games, while adults sat at picnic tables, sharing stories and enjoying the moment. For the Hendersons, this was more than just a party. It was a symbol of hard work, perseverance, and pride. Marcus was the first in his family to graduate with such high honors, and his future looked bright. He had already been accepted into several prestigious universities, and the family couldn't have been prouder. His mother, Renee, smiled as she watched him joke with his friends, his face glowing with happiness and excitement for the future. Renee worked tirelessly to make this day special for her son. She had spent days planning the menu, organizing decorations, and calling friends and family. It wasn't just about Marcus's achievement, it was about celebrating the strength of their family, the challenges they had faced, and the love that held them together. Her husband, James, was busy manning the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with their neighbors who had stopped by to join the festivities. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared their joy. Across the street, Mr. Johnson sat on his porch, frowning as he watched the party unfold. He was an older man, in his late 60s, and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. From the moment the Hendersons moved in 5 years ago, he had made it clear that he wasn't happy about having them as neighbors. It wasn't something he ever said outright, but the way he glared at them from across his yard, the passive-aggressive comments he made about keeping the noise down or too many cars in the street, told the story. Mr. Johnson believed that the Hendersons didn't belong. As the party continued, Johnson's irritation grew. The music, the laughter, it was all too much for him. He muttered to himself about the noise and the disruption, glaring at the happy scene from his porch. It wasn't the first time he had called the police on them for minor complaints. Whether it was a holiday barbecue or a family gathering, he always found a reason to complain. Today, however, his frustration reached a tipping point. He picked up his phone, dialing the local police. His voice was tight with annoyance as he explained that there was a loud party happening across the street, making sure to mention that the guests were causing a disturbance. He hung up, satisfied that he had done his part, expecting the police to come and restore what he believed was the peace of his neighborhood. As he sat back, he watched the Hendersons continue to laugh and enjoy themselves, unaware of what was coming. Little did Mr. Johnson know that this time things wouldn't go as he expected. The party continued in full swing, the warm afternoon air buzzing with the sounds of conversation and music. Renee stood by the table, handing out slices of cake to eager children, her heart swelling with pride each time someone congratulated her on Marcus's achievements. She hadn't felt this content in a long time. Her son's success meant everything, not just to her, but to the whole family. Today was about celebrating him, and nothing could take that away. Or so she thought. As she turned to refill a tray of drinks, James caught her eye from the grill, giving her a smile. She smiled back, grateful for how perfect everything seemed. But that moment of peace was interrupted by a sound that made her pause. The low rumble of police car engines pulling up outside the house. Heads turned as 2 squad cars came into view, slowly rolling to a stop in front of the Henderson home. The chatter quieted, and the music was turned down as a few of the guests exchanged confused glances. Renee's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with questions. Why were the police here? Was something wrong? James put down his spatula, wiping his hands on a towel as he stepped toward the front of the house, concern clouding his face. He and Renee exchanged a quick look, neither of them understanding what was happening. She followed him to the front yard, where the officers were already stepping out of their vehicles, their faces calm but serious. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said, nodding in their direction. "We received a complaint about a disturbance in the area." "A disturbance?" James echoed, his voice careful, masking his confusion. He glanced back at the party in the backyard. Sure, it was lively, but it was far from what anyone could call a disturbance. "Yes, sir," the officer continued, looking past him to the gathering. A neighbor reported loud noise and a large group of people. Renee felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who had made the call. Her eyes darted across the street to Mr. Johnson's house, where she could just make out his figure sitting on his porch, watching the scene unfold with a cold satisfaction. "Officer, we're just having a family celebration for our son," Renee said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not causing any trouble. We've kept the noise down, and everyone here is just enjoying themselves." The officer shifted, glancing at his partner, who was scanning the backyard with his eyes. Neither of them looked particularly alarmed, but the situation was still unsettling. The Hendersons had seen this kind of thing before. Calls made to police for no other reason than making a black family feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood. "Well," the officer said, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the air, "we just need to check things out, make sure everything is in order." Renee's heart raced as she watched the officer's eyes. This was their home, their celebration, their community. Why did they have to prove themselves every time? And how many more times would this happen before it stopped? James nodded, stepping aside to allow the officers to look around. "Go ahead. We've got nothing to hide." As the officers began walking toward the backyard, a small crowd of concerned guests gathered at the side of the house, watching in silence. The joyful energy that had filled the air only minutes before was now replaced by a quiet tension. Even Marcus, still surrounded by his friends, looked confused, his smile fading as he noticed the police moving closer. Renee took a deep breath, feeling a surge of anger rise in her chest. She wasn't going to let this moment be ruined, not after everything they'd done to make it perfect. But as she watched the officers approach, she knew things were about to take a turn, though perhaps not in the way anyone expected. As the officers moved closer to the backyard, the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Where there had once been laughter and celebration, now there was only silence and unease. The Henderson family and their guests stood still, waiting for what would happen next. Even the children, who had been running around and playing, huddled closer to their parents, sensing that something was wrong. Renee followed the officers as they made their way toward the gathering. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but out of frustration. How many times had they been through something like this? How many times had their family's happiness been interrupted by someone who couldn't stand to see them enjoying themselves in peace? James, always the calmer of the two, walked beside her, his hand gently resting on her arm. "It's going to be fine," he murmured, though even he sounded unsure. He glanced back at their guests, giving a small nod as if to reassure them. The officers paused when they reached the center of the backyard. The music had stopped, and all eyes were on them. One of the officers, a younger man with kind eyes, looked around at the crowd before turning to James. "Looks like a nice gathering," the officer said, his voice softer than before. "Congratulations, by the way," he added, nodding toward Marcus, who was standing a few feet away. Marcus, surprised to be addressed, blinked. Thanks," he said, his voice tentative. His friend stood beside him, exchanging nervous glances. The officer's partner, an older man with a more serious expression, cleared his throat. "We're just here to check on things. A neighbor called in a complaint, but—" He hesitated, glancing around the peaceful scene. "It doesn't seem like there's any issue." There was a murmur of agreement from the guests, who, while still uneasy, began to relax slightly. A few of them nodded toward the officers, offering polite smiles. But the tension still lingered, thick in the air. No one was sure if this was really over. "Who called?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. The younger officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner before responding. "Mr. Johnson from across the street," he said, his voice low. "He mentioned something about noise and a large crowd." Renee felt her fists clench at her sides. She knew it. She knew that man had been watching them, waiting for an excuse to ruin their day. Her eyes flickered toward Mr. Johnson's house, where she could still see him sitting on his porch, pretending not to watch. Her blood boiled, but she kept her composure. This was not the time for an outburst. James stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, we've done nothing wrong. We're just celebrating our son's graduation. This isn't the first time Mr. Johnson has called the police on us for no reason, and frankly, it's getting out of hand." The younger officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I hear you," he said. "It doesn't seem like there's any real disturbance here. We'll go talk to Mr. Johnson and let him know that everything's in order." Renee and James exchanged a glance, both relieved and still on edge. The officers seemed understanding, but the damage had already been done. Their celebration had been tainted by suspicion, and once again, they were reminded that in this neighborhood, they weren't always welcome. Just as the officers turned to leave, one of the guests, an older woman named Mrs. Jenkins, spoke up. "You know," she said, her voice strong, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I've seen plenty of parties. Never once have I seen the police show up unless this family is involved." The officers paused, clearly taken aback. Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I think it's time somebody has a word with Mr. Johnson about what's really going on here." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, and even some of the younger guests nodded. It was clear that this wasn't just about noise or a party. It was about something much deeper. The officers, now fully aware of the undercurrent running through the situation, looked at each other again. The younger officer, who had shown sympathy from the beginning, seemed to make a decision. "We'll talk to him," he said, "and we'll make sure he understands that this kind of behavior isn't going to be tolerated." With that, the officers walked toward the front of the house, leaving behind a crowd that was no longer just relieved, but ready to stand up against the injustice they had seen for far too long. As the officers walked toward Mr. Johnson's house, the mood in the Hendersons' backyard began to shift. People whispered quietly to each other, sharing stories and frustrations about how this kind of thing seemed to happen far too often. Many of them had experienced similar encounters, quiet moments of joy interrupted by someone who couldn't stand the idea of a black family living peacefully among them. Renee stood next to James, watching as the officers made their way across the street. She felt a surge of anger rising in her chest, but it was tempered by a deep sense of exhaustion. How many more times would they have to endure this? How many more celebrations would be cut short by Mr. Johnson's unnecessary complaints? James put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Renee," he said softly, though his own voice was thick with frustration. "They'll talk to him. Maybe this time it'll stop." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. After all, this wasn't the first time Mr. Johnson had tried to make their lives difficult. Ever since the Hendersons moved in, he had made it clear, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that he didn't want them there. Across the street, the officers approached Mr. Johnson's porch. He had been sitting there, pretending to read a newspaper, but now he looked up, his face hardening as the officers stopped in front of him. He set the paper down slowly, crossing his arms as if preparing for a confrontation. "Mr. Johnson?" the younger officer asked, his voice polite but firm. "We need to have a word with you." "What seems to be the problem, officers?" Mr. Johnson replied, though there was an edge to his voice. "I called you because there's a disturbance across the street. That family is always making noise, and they've got a huge crowd over there. I can't even sit on my own porch in peace." The officer remained calm, but there was a new sharpness in his tone. "We've already spoken to the Henderson family," he said. "They're having a graduation party for their son, and everything is well within the noise ordinance. We didn't find anything out of order." Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe you didn't look hard enough. They always have people coming and going, playing music all hours of the day. It's a disruption, and I've had enough of it." The older officer, who had been silent up to this point, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, we've been here multiple times for complaints you've made against the Henderson family. Every time we've found nothing wrong. You need to understand that they have the right to celebrate just like anyone else." Mr. Johnson's face flushed red, his lips tightening into a thin line. He opened his mouth to argue, but the younger officer cut him off. "This isn't about noise, is it, Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "This is about you not wanting them here. This is about you using us to harass your neighbors because you don't like the fact that they live in your neighborhood." For a moment, Mr. Johnson was silent, his face growing even redder. The officers had called him out directly, and he wasn't prepared for that. His bravado faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "They don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the officers to hear. The older officer shook his head, his expression firm. "Mr. Johnson, that kind of thinking doesn't have a place here. If you continue to call us without a valid reason, you could face consequences for filing false reports." The younger officer leaned in slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This is the last time we're coming out for a call like this, Mr. Johnson. If you can't accept that they have every right to live here and celebrate like anyone else, then that's your problem, not theirs." With that, the officers turned and walked back toward the Hendersons' home, leaving Mr. Johnson sitting on his porch, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He had been called out, and though he didn't respond, the message was clear. The power he thought he held was slipping from his grasp. Back in the Hendersons' yard, the guests watched in silence as the officers returned. There was a collective sense of relief, but also a quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. Everyone knew that this wouldn't be the last time someone like Mr. Johnson would try to disrupt their lives. But today, at least, they had stood their ground. As the officers approached, James stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude but also a quiet resignation. "We appreciate you handling this the way you did." The younger officer nodded. "We'll make sure he understands that this kind of harassment won't be tolerated anymore," he said. "You all enjoy the rest of your celebration. You've earned it." Renee exhaled, feeling some of the tension leave her body, though her mind was still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had been heard. The party slowly resumed after Mr. Johnson returned to his house. But the mood was different now. It wasn't just the interruption or the appearance of the police that had shifted the atmosphere. Something deeper had been stirred. For a long time, the Henderson family and their guests had simply accepted the tension that came with being one of the few black families in the neighborhood. They had learned to brush off the small slights, the disapproving looks, and even the passive-aggressive comments. But today had brought everything to the surface. Renee glanced at her guests, noting the subtle shift in their behavior. Conversations were quieter, more subdued. People still smiled, but the carefree energy that had filled the backyard earlier seemed distant now, like something fragile that had been shattered. She watched as Marcus stood with his friends, still trying to laugh and enjoy the moment. But there was a wariness in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. She looked over at James, who had returned to the grill, but his usual easy smile was gone. He was focused on the task in front of him, flipping burgers with an almost mechanical precision. Renee knew that look. It was the same one he had every time something like this happened, when their dignity and peace were questioned, not by words, but by actions. The children, too, had picked up on the unease. They were no longer chasing each other around the yard. Instead, they clustered together near their parents, their bright, carefree laughter replaced by quiet whispers and questioning glances. Renee sighed and made her way over to James, resting a hand gently on his arm. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his words. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice low. "Just tired of this, you know." Renee understood exactly what he meant. They had moved into this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a place where they could raise their kids in peace. And for the most part, it had been just that. The community was diverse, and most of their neighbors had welcomed them with open arms. But then there were people like Mr. Johnson, who couldn't stand to see them succeed, who viewed their joy and togetherness as some kind of threat. "It's exhausting," Renee admitted, glancing across the street at Mr. Johnson's house. He had retreated inside, out of sight, but the weight of his actions lingered like a shadow over the celebration. Every time something good happens, he tries to bring us down. James set down the spatula, turning to face her. "But not today," he said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "Not this time. We're not going to let him take this from us." Renee smiled at him, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her chest. He was right. As frustrating and painful as it was, they couldn't let one bitter man spoil the joy they had worked so hard for. This was their day, their family's moment, and they deserved to enjoy it. Slowly, Renee began to feel a shift. The guests, noticing her and James's renewed energy, started to pick up where they had left off. A few people returned to their conversations. The children cautiously began playing again, and someone even turned the music back on. Softly at first, but with each passing minute, the volume crept back up, as if reclaiming the space they had momentarily lost. It was Mrs. Jenkins who helped bring the spirit of the party back. The elderly neighbor, who had spoken up earlier, walked over to Marcus, her face bright with pride. "I've known you since you were just a little boy," she said, her voice warm and full of admiration. "And I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Marcus smiled, his earlier uncertainty replaced by gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins." "You've earned this, Marcus," she continued, turning to the crowd. "All of you have. This family has been nothing but kind, welcoming, and a joy to have in our neighborhood. And today, we're here to celebrate you, not anyone else's nonsense." The crowd murmured in agreement, and slowly, the energy returned to what it had been before. People began laughing again, congratulating Marcus, sharing stories, and the children, reassured by the adults' sense of calm, resumed their games with renewed enthusiasm. But even as the party came back to life, Renee knew that things wouldn't go back to normal right away. Something had shifted in the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson's actions weren't just a petty disruption. They were a reminder of the deeper, more insidious prejudices that still lingered, even in the most seemingly welcoming places. And while the party continued, the shadow of that truth hung in the air, reminding them all of the battle that still lay ahead. For now, though, they had won this moment. The celebration continued, and the Henderson family stood tall, proud of what they had achieved, not just as a family, but as a part of this community. Today, they would focus on the joy, on Marcus's success, and on the love that had brought them all together. But tomorrow, they would be ready to face whatever came next. As the party regained its rhythm, Renee took a moment to stand back and take it all in. The music was playing again, the kids were laughing, and the adults had fallen back into their conversations. Still, that small undercurrent of unease remained just beneath the surface, lingering like a faint echo of the disruption that had threatened to derail their celebration. But they were stronger than that, she reminded herself. Stronger as a family, stronger as a community. Just as Renee was about to join a group of guests at one of the tables, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head and saw something that made her pause, a figure walking toward them from across the street. It was Mr. Johnson. Her heart skipped a beat, and her first instinct was to brace for whatever confrontation he might be bringing. She quickly glanced over at James, who had noticed the same thing. His expression tightened, but he remained still, watching as the older man approached. Mr. Johnson moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if he weren't entirely sure what he was going to say once he arrived. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his face tense but not as angry as it had been before. The guests noticed him too, and one by one their conversations died down again, a few people exchanging concerned glances. Renee felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. What did he want now? Hadn't he already done enough by calling the police and trying to ruin their day? But something about his posture stopped her from assuming the worst. He didn't look hostile, just uncertain. Finally, Mr. Johnson came to a halt just a few feet from where James and Renee stood. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the two of them, as if struggling to find the right words. "Mr. Johnson," James said, his voice steady but cautious, "what can we do for you?" The older man didn't respond right away. He shifted on his feet, looking around at the backyard, at the guests who were now watching him silently. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn around and walk away without saying anything at all. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of his actions had finally settled on him. I wanted to say I might have overreacted earlier, he mumbled, his voice gruff but softer than usual. Renee blinked, taken aback. She had never heard Mr. Johnson admit to being wrong about anything, let alone apologize for his behavior. She glanced at James, who looked just as surprised as she felt. "We're just having a celebration for our son," James said after a pause, his tone measured. "It's a special day for our family." "I know," Mr. Johnson muttered, his gaze fixed on the ground. He looked older than Renee had realized, the lines on his face deepened by years of bitterness. I've never been good with noise, and, well, it's been a hard year." Renee wasn't sure what to make of this sudden admission. It was true that Mr. Johnson had lost his wife not too long ago, and while he'd never been friendly with them before, his hostility had only worsened after her passing. Maybe in some twisted way, his anger toward them was less about their race and more about his own loneliness, though that hardly excused his behavior. "We're sorry for your loss, Mr. Johnson," Renee said gently, though she kept her voice firm. "But calling the police on us, especially when we haven't done anything wrong, isn't the way to handle things." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly, still not meeting their eyes. "I know. I don't know what else to do sometimes." There was a long, awkward silence as everyone tried to process what was happening. This wasn't the confrontation they had expected, but it also wasn't a clear-cut apology. Mr. Johnson's actions were rooted in something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed with a few words of regret. But still, there he was, standing in front of them, trying in his own clumsy way to make amends, or at least explain himself. "Look," James said, his voice calm but firm, "we're your neighbors. We're part of this community just like you are. If you're having a hard time, we understand. But that doesn't mean you get to treat us like we don't belong here." For the first time, Mr. Johnson looked up, meeting James's gaze. There was something vulnerable in his eyes, something that hinted at regret or perhaps shame. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to go the way they did." Renee took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't the apology she had expected, and it wasn't enough to erase the harm that had been done. But it was a start, a small crack in the wall Mr. Johnson had built between them. "We just want to live in peace," Renee said, her voice soft but firm. "That's all we've ever wanted." Mr. Johnson nodded again, his expression tight. I'll try to keep that in mind," he muttered before turning to walk back toward his house. As he disappeared across the street, the guests slowly began to relax, though the tension still hung in the air. It wasn't the resolution they had hoped for, but perhaps it was the beginning of something different. Time would tell. The party slowly resumed after Mr. Johnson returned to his house, but the mood was different now. It wasn't just the interruption or the appearance of the police that had shifted the atmosphere. Something deeper had been stirred. For a long time, the Henderson family and their guests had simply accepted the tension that came with being one of the few black families in the neighborhood. They had learned to brush off the small slights, the disapproving looks, and even the passive-aggressive comments. But today had brought everything to the surface. Renee glanced at her guests, noting the subtle shift in their behavior. Conversations were quieter, more subdued. People still smiled, but the carefree energy that had filled the backyard earlier seemed distant now, like something fragile that had been shattered. She watched as Marcus stood with his friends, still trying to laugh and enjoy the moment. But there was a wariness in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. She looked over at James, who had returned to the grill, but his usual easy smile was gone. He was focused on the task in front of him, flipping burgers with an almost mechanical precision. Renee knew that look. It was the same one he had every time something like this happened. when their dignity and peace were questioned, not by words, but by actions. The children, too, had picked up on the unease. They were no longer chasing each other around the yard. Instead, they clustered together near their parents, their bright, carefree laughter replaced by quiet whispers and questioning glances. Renee sighed and made her way over to James, resting a hand gently on his arm. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his words. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice low. "Just tired of this, you know." Renee understood exactly what he meant. They had moved into this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a place where they could raise their kids in peace. And for the most part, it had been just that. The community was diverse and most of their neighbors had welcomed them with open arms. But then there were people like Mr. Johnson, who couldn't stand to see them succeed, who viewed their joy and togetherness as some kind of threat. "It's exhausting," Renee admitted, glancing across the street at Mr. Johnson's house. He had retreated inside, out of sight, but the weight of his actions lingered like a shadow over the celebration. "Every time something good happens, he tries to bring us down." James set down the spatula, turning to face her. "But not today," he said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "Not this time. We're not going to let him take this from us." Renee smiled at him, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her chest. He was right. As frustrating and painful as it was, they couldn't let one bitter man spoil the joy they had worked so hard for. This was their day, their family's moment, and they deserved to enjoy it. Slowly, Renee began to feel a shift. The guests, noticing her and James's renewed energy, started to pick up where they had left off. A few people returned to their conversations. The children cautiously began playing again, and someone even turned the music back on. Softly at first, but with each passing minute, the volume crept back up, as if reclaiming the space they had momentarily lost. It was Mrs. Jenkins who helped bring the spirit of the party back. The elderly neighbor, who had spoken up earlier, walked over to Marcus, her face bright with pride. "I've known you since you were just a little boy," she said, her voice warm and full of admiration. "And I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." Marcus smiled, his earlier uncertainty replaced by gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins." "You've earned this, Marcus," she continued, turning to the crowd. "All of you have. This family has been nothing but kind, welcoming, and a joy to have in our neighborhood. And today, we're here to celebrate you, not anyone else's nonsense." The crowd murmured in agreement, and slowly, the energy returned to what it had been before. People began laughing again, congratulating Marcus, sharing stories, and the children, reassured by the adults' sense of calm, resumed their games with renewed enthusiasm. But even as the party came back to life, Renee knew that things wouldn't go back to normal right away. Something had shifted in the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson's actions weren't just a petty disruption. They were a reminder of the deeper, more insidious prejudices that still lingered, even in the most seemingly welcoming places. And while the party continued, the shadow of that truth hung in the air, reminding them all of the battle that still lay ahead. For now, though, they had won this moment. The celebration continued, and the Henderson family stood tall, proud of what they had achieved, not just as a family, but as a part of this community. Today, they would focus on the joy, on Marcus's success, and on the love that had brought them all together. But tomorrow they would be ready to face whatever came next. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the Hendersons' backyard, the party finally began to settle into the celebration it was meant to be. The guests, who had initially been shaken by the appearance of the police and the tense encounter with Mr. Johnson, now seemed to relax. Conversations resumed, laughter rang out, and the sound of clinking glasses filled the air once again. The children had returned to their games, chasing each other across the lawn as if nothing had ever interrupted the day. Renee found herself sitting at one of the tables, watching the scene unfold with a deep sense of pride. Marcus was surrounded by friends and family, his face bright with laughter again, the earlier unease starting to fade. She smiled to herself, knowing how hard her son had worked to reach this point, graduating with honors, being accepted to universities that would shape his future. This was his day, and despite everything, they had managed to keep it about him. Still, Renee's mind wandered back to Mr. Johnson and the encounter that had shaken the party. She couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the last time they would have to deal with him or others like him. His thin apology had barely scratched the surface of the underlying issue, his refusal to accept them as equals, as neighbors who belonged just as much as he did. But today wasn't the day to dwell on that. There would be time to address it later. As she sat, lost in thought, she was joined by a group of neighbors who had seen everything unfold. Mrs. Jenkins, as always, was the first to speak, her voice carrying that same tone of conviction that had helped steer the party back on course earlier. "You know, Renee," she said, settling down beside her, "there's something to be said about how you handled all of this today. A lot of folks wouldn't have had the patience or the grace to do what you and James did." Renee smiled, though it was tinged with weariness. "I don't know if it was grace," she replied softly. "I'm just tired, Mrs. Jenkins. Tired of always having to prove ourselves. Tired of always being the ones to rise above it. Sometimes I wonder if it's ever going to change." Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I understand, honey. Believe me, I do. But you're making more of an impact than you realize. People see how you stand up for yourselves, how you don't let people like Mr. Johnson tear you down. And that matters." Across the table, another neighbor, Mr. Davis, chimed in. He was a middle-aged man who had moved into the neighborhood just a few years after the Hendersons. "What Mrs. Jenkins is saying is true, Renee. When my family moved in, we had our own share of trouble, though not as bad as what you've been dealing with. But seeing you and James handle things the way you do, it's inspiring. It's a reminder that we all deserve to be here." Renee looked around the table, seeing the faces of her neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Davis, and several others, each nodding in agreement. She hadn't realized how much their strength as a family had meant to those around them. In some ways, she and James had become pillars of the community, not just for their resilience, but for the way they had shown that standing up for themselves didn't mean lowering themselves to the level of those who tried to bring them down. "I appreciate that," Renee said quietly. "But it's not always easy, you know." "We know," Mrs. Jenkins replied, "but that's why it's so important. You're showing the rest of us how to do it, with dignity and pride. And you're showing Mr. Johnson that no matter what he tries to do, he's not going to win." The group murmured in agreement, and for the first time that day, Renee felt something lift inside her, a sense of relief, of understanding. She had been so focused on protecting her family, on making sure Marcus's day wasn't ruined, that she hadn't stopped to realize the impact their quiet strength was having on the community around them. In a way, this wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about everyone who had faced the same struggles, the same moments of doubt and frustration. And in standing up for themselves, they were standing up for all of them. As the conversation continued, James walked over and sat down next to Renee, placing a comforting hand on her back. He had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was being said, and he nodded as Mrs. Jenkins spoke. "We're not just neighbors," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. "We're a community. And when one of us gets knocked down, the rest of us have to stand together. That's how we make sure people like Mr. Johnson don't get to keep pulling this nonsense." James smiled, though there was a seriousness in his expression. "You're right. And I think after today he knows that. He knows we're not going to back down, not anymore." For a moment, there was a comfortable silence as everyone took in the weight of what had happened that day. It wasn't just about Marcus's graduation, or even about the confrontation with Mr. Johnson. It was about the slow but steady realization that they were not alone, that the strength they had shown was part of something larger, a collective resilience that had been building for years, quietly but powerfully. Renee leaned back in her chair, watching as the sun continued to set, casting long shadows over the backyard. The day was drawing to a close, but the impact of what had happened would linger far beyond this evening. There would be more challenges, more confrontations, but today had shown them all that together they could face whatever came next. And in that moment, surrounded by her family, her friends, and her community, Renee felt a quiet sense of victory. They hadn't just reclaimed the day, they had reclaimed their place, their right to live, love, and celebrate in peace. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. As the evening wore on, the energy of the party slowly began to shift again. The sun had set, and the backyard was illuminated by the soft glow of string lights hung from the trees. The once lively celebration had quieted into something more intimate. Most of the guests had either gone home or gathered in smaller groups, talking quietly or enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. The kids had grown tired and were now resting on blankets spread across the grass, the remnants of the day's excitement finally catching up to them. Renee found herself sitting at one of the now mostly empty tables, a cup of lemonade in her hand, as she watched the flickering lights. It had been a long day, longer than she'd expected, and though she was grateful for the way it had turned out, she was exhausted. The emotional toll of the afternoon was settling in, and she finally had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. James joined her, pulling up a chair next to hers. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there quietly, letting the calm of the evening wrap around them both. Renee was grateful for the silence. Sometimes, after a day like this, words weren't necessary. Just being together was enough. For a while, they sat like that, side by side, watching as the last of their guests began to trickle out. Marcus had retreated inside the house with some of his friends, likely to play video games or relax after the emotional roller coaster of the day. Renee was glad he still had the energy to enjoy his night, despite everything. Finally, James broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking," he began, his gaze fixed on the soft glow of the lights. "About today. About everything that happened." Renee nodded, though she didn't speak right away. She had been thinking about it too, turning over the events of the day in her mind, trying to make sense of the different emotions it had stirred. Relief, anger, exhaustion, pride. They had all hit her in waves, and she was still processing what it all meant. "I knew something like this would happen eventually," James continued, his voice calm but steady. "We've been dealing with Johnson's nonsense for years, but today felt different. I think it's because we finally pushed back." Renee turned to look at him, surprised by his words. James was usually the one who kept the peace, who tried to avoid conflict whenever possible, but today had been different. He had been calm, but there was a quiet fire behind his words when he'd spoken to the police, when he'd stood his ground in front of Mr. Johnson. It was the kind of strength Renee had always admired in him, silent but unshakable. "Yeah," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet admiration. "You did." He shrugged, giving her a small smile. "We both did. You were right there with me, like always." Renee smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was true. They had always faced these kinds of challenges together, side by side. But today had felt like a turning point, a moment when they had drawn a line in the sand, not just for themselves, but for their entire community. "I'm just tired of it, James," she admitted after a long pause. "I'm tired of feeling like we have to prove ourselves every time we have something to celebrate. Tired of having to justify our existence in a place we've called home for years." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, it's exhausting, but I think today showed us that we're not alone in this. Our neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Davis, they've got our backs, and I think that's going to make a difference." Renee leaned back in her chair, letting his words sink in. He was right. Today had revealed something important, something that had always been there but had never been fully recognized. They weren't just a family fighting for their place in this neighborhood. They were part of a larger community, one that was ready to stand up against the prejudice that had tried to creep into their lives. And that, more than anything, gave her hope. "I think you're right," she said, her voice steady. "We're not alone. And maybe Maybe things will change. James smiled again, though it was a little sad this time. I hope so. But if they don't, we'll keep doing what we've always done. We'll keep standing up for ourselves, for our family, and eventually people like Johnson will see that they can't win. Renee reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. We will, she agreed. We've made it this far, we're not backing down now. They sat there in silence for a while longer, holding hands and watching as the last of the guests trickled out of the backyard, the night settling around them like a comforting blanket. The challenges they had faced today were not new, and they wouldn't be the last. But there was something different now, something that made Renee believe they were heading in the right direction. As the final guests said their goodbyes, James turned to Renee. Let's go inside. We've earned a little peace and quiet. Renee smiled, feeling the weight of the day lift just a little. Yeah, she said softly. Let's go. With that, they stood up together, leaving the quiet backyard behind and stepping inside their home, tired but resolute, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, as they always had. The next morning dawned bright and calm, as if the previous day's events were nothing but a distant memory. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room where Marcus sat on the couch, flipping through his phone. The sounds of breakfast cooking in the kitchen drifted through the house. Renee was at the stove frying eggs and bacon, while James set the table. Despite the peace of the morning, the tension from the day before still lingered in the air, unspoken but present. The party had ended on a positive note, but the encounter with Mr. Johnson and the arrival of the police had left its mark. Marcus, though outwardly fine, seemed quieter than usual, his usual energy tempered by something heavier. Renee, sensing the change in her son, paused in her cooking and called out to him. Marcus, honey, come help set the table. Marcus put his phone down and wandered into the kitchen. His movements were slower than usual, and Renee could tell that he was still processing everything that had happened. She glanced at James, who caught her look and nodded, silently agreeing that they needed to talk to Marcus about it. Once the table was set, they all sat down for breakfast. The clatter of silverware and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but the usual lively conversation that accompanied their meals was absent. It was James who finally broke the silence. Marcus, he began, his voice gentle but serious. I know yesterday was a lot to take in. Marcus looked up from his plate, his eyes briefly meeting his father's before looking away again. Yeah, it was, he admitted quietly. I mean, I knew Mr. Johnson didn't like us, but I didn't think he'd actually call the cops. Renee's heart tightened at his words. She hated that her son had to deal with this kind of reality. Hated that he had to learn so young that there were people in the world who would try to tear him down simply because of the color of his skin. But at the same time, she knew they couldn't shield him from it. They had to prepare him for it, guide him through it. I wish I could tell you that this will be the last time something like this happens, Renee said softly. But it won't be. There will always be people like Mr. Johnson who don't see us for who we are, who see us as a problem just because we exist. Marcus frowned. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. So what am I supposed to do? Just ignore it? James shook his head. No, son, you don't ignore it. But you don't let it define you either. Yesterday was tough, but you saw what happened in the end. The police didn't find anything wrong because we weren't doing anything wrong. And when people like Mr. Johnson try to take away our joy, we stand up for ourselves. We stand together. Marcus pushed his food around on his plate, his expression thoughtful. I guess I just didn't expect it to happen on my day, you know. I didn't want the party to be about that. Renee reached across the table and took Marcus's hand, her voice filled with empathy. I know, baby, and it wasn't about that. Yes, Mr. Johnson tried to ruin it, but he didn't. Your day was about you, about your hard work and your future. Don't let him take that from you. Marcus nodded, though the sadness hadn't fully left his eyes. I'll try. They ate in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Renee could see the wheels turning in Marcus's head, could see that he was trying to process everything, trying to understand how to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. After a while, James spoke again, his tone more relaxed. "You know, Marcus, what happened yesterday doesn't change the fact that we're all so proud of you. You've worked hard, and you've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone, not even people like Mr. Johnson, take that away from you." Marcus smiled faintly at that, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Dad." Renee watched him carefully, trying to gauge how he was really feeling. She knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. It couldn't be. But for now, it was enough to remind Marcus of the love and support surrounding him, to let him know that he wasn't alone in facing the challenges ahead. As they finished breakfast, Renee cleared the plates and James started the coffee maker for another round. The day stretched out before them, filled with quiet routines and the sense of calm that always followed the intensity of a major event. But even as they settled into the rhythm of the morning, Renee knew that things had shifted. Yesterday had been a turning point, not just for their family but for their community. Mr. Johnson's actions had been a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but they had also revealed something important. They were not alone. Their neighbors had stood with them, and their quiet resilience had sent a message, not just to Mr. Johnson, but to everyone watching. As Marcus excused himself from the table to go outside, Renee followed him to the door. She watched as he stepped onto the porch, looking out at the quiet street, his hands shoved into his pockets. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say, but then the words came to her. "You know, Marcus," she said softly, "what happened yesterday was hard, but it showed us something important." Marcus glanced at her, his expression curious. "What's that?" "It showed us that we're stronger than people like Mr. Johnson think we are," Renee said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "And it showed us that we're not alone. There are people who will stand with us no matter what, and that's something worth holding on to." Marcus nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I guess it is." The day moved on quietly, but the events of the previous day had left a ripple through the neighborhood. Even though the Henderson family was settling back into their routine, word of what had happened spread, and it wasn't long before some of the neighbors stopped by to talk. In the early afternoon, while Renee was tidying up the backyard, she saw Mrs. Jenkins approaching from across the street. The older woman walked with purpose, her face set in a determined expression. Renee waved, setting down the broom she had been using. "Renee," Mrs. Jenkins called out as she reached the yard. "Mind if I have a word?" "Of course, come on in," Renee replied, smiling. Despite everything, Mrs. Jenkins had always been one of their biggest supporters. She was a strong-willed woman who had never shied away from calling things as she saw them, and today seemed no different. Mrs. Jenkins stepped into the backyard and gave a quick look around. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," she said, not wasting any time. "And I think we need to have a conversation with the neighborhood about it." Renee raised her eyebrows. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms, her face stern. "This isn't just about what Mr. Johnson did yesterday. It's about the fact that things like this keep happening, and nobody talks about it. He's not the only one in this neighborhood with outdated ideas, and if we don't address it, it's going to keep happening." Renee frowned, considering her words. She had always known that Mr. Johnson's actions were just part of a larger problem, but she hadn't thought about how they might start addressing it as a community. "What exactly are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking we need to hold a community meeting," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. "We get the neighbors together, we talk openly about what's going on, and we make it clear that this kind of behavior, calling the police on people for no reason, making them feel unwelcome, isn't going to be tolerated anymore." Renee hesitated. It wasn't that she disagreed, but the idea of standing up in front of the whole neighborhood and confronting these issues head-on was intimidating. They had always tried to keep the peace, to avoid causing waves, but maybe Mrs. Jenkins was right. Maybe it was time for things to change. Before Renee could respond, James stepped out of the house, wiping his hands on a towel. He had heard the last part of the conversation and looked between Renee and Mrs. Jenkins with curiosity. "What's this about a community meeting?" he asked, his tone cautious but intrigued. Mrs. Jenkins turned to him, nodding. "I was just telling Renee that after what happened yesterday, we need to address this as a neighborhood. People need to understand that what Mr. Johnson did was unacceptable, and more importantly, that this kind of behavior isn't going to be tolerated anymore." James listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "It's been happening for too long, and we've let it slide because we didn't want to stir up trouble. But maybe it's time we start having these conversations." Renee looked between the two of them, feeling a growing sense of resolve. She had always been the one to focus on protecting her family, on keeping things together for Marcus and for their peace of mind. But maybe now it was time to take that strength and share it with the community, to push for something bigger than just their own comfort. "I think it's a good idea," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk about this, and not just with the people who already support us, but with the ones who don't." Mrs. Jenkins smiled, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. We can't keep letting people like Mr. Johnson get away with their little stunts. It's time we stand up, as a community, and make it clear that we're not going to be pushed around." James nodded in agreement. "And we need to get as many people involved as we can. This isn't just about us. It's about making sure that everyone, especially families who might move here in the future, feel welcome." Renee could feel the weight of the decision settling in her chest, but it wasn't an uncomfortable weight. It was the kind of weight that came with knowing you were about to do something important, something necessary. "So," she said, straightening up and looking at Mrs. Jenkins and James with newfound determination, "how do we start?" Mrs. Jenkins grinned, clearly pleased with Renee's resolve. "Well, first we get the word out. I know a few neighbors who will be on board with this right away. Mr. Davis, the Ramirez family, and a few others. We talk to them, and then we spread the word. If we're going to do this, we need to have a strong turnout." James crossed his arms, nodding thoughtfully. "We'll need a place to hold the meeting, too. Maybe the local community center?" "That could work," Mrs. Jenkins agreed. "I'll make a few calls. We want to get this done sooner rather than later, while yesterday is still fresh in everyone's minds." As the conversation continued, Renee felt a surge of energy. This wasn't just about addressing Mr. Johnson's actions anymore. It was about changing the culture of the neighborhood, about making sure that everyone who lived there understood that their community was one of respect, inclusion, and support. By the time Mrs. Jenkins left, plans were already in motion. The three of them had decided to hold the meeting within the week, and Mrs. Jenkins had volunteered to spread the word among the neighbors she knew. Renee and James would focus on gathering support from the families they had become close to over the years. As Renee watched Mrs. Jenkins walk away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they weren't just reacting to what was happening around them. They were taking control, shaping their future in a way that would make a lasting difference. James came up beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice gentle but serious. Renee nodded, leaning into him. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think it's time." They stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be resistance, but for the first time, Renee felt like they were ready to face it, together. The day of the community meeting arrived quicker than Renee had expected. The week had flown by in a blur of phone calls, conversations with neighbors, and quiet moments of doubt about what they were about to undertake. Yet, every time those doubts crept in, she reminded herself of what was at stake, not just for her family, but for every family in the neighborhood. The local community center was bustling with activity as neighbors arrived one by one, filling the seats in the large hall. Mrs. Jenkins had done an incredible job getting the word out, and now the room was full, not just with familiar faces, but with people Renee had never spoken to before. It was clear that the events of the previous weekend had stirred something in the community. People were ready to talk. James stood next to her at the front of the room, his presence as steady as always. Marcus sat with a group of his friends near the middle, looking both proud and nervous to see so many people gathered to address what had happened. Renee could see a few of the older kids whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of what was happening. As the last few people filed in, Mrs. Jenkins took the floor, her voice loud and clear. "Thank you all for coming," she began, looking around the room with a serious expression. "I know we've all got busy lives, but after what happened last week, it became clear to me, and to a lot of us, that we need to have this conversation. Not just for the Hendersons, but for all of us." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and Renee could feel the energy in the room shift. This wasn't just about her family anymore. This was about the entire neighborhood standing up and saying that they wouldn't tolerate the kind of divisiveness that had reared its head in their community. Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice firm and unwavering. "We've been seeing these issues, these small, underhanded acts of exclusion and discrimination, go unchecked for too long. It's not just about one man calling the police on his neighbors. It's about a mindset, an attitude that makes some people think they have the right to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. Well, I'm here to say that we all belong here, every single one of us." The room erupted into applause, the sound of it echoing through the hall. Renee glanced at James, who gave her a reassuring smile. They had talked about whether or not to speak at the meeting, and they had decided to let others take the lead. It wasn't about centering their story, it was about the collective voices of the community. As the applause died down, Mr. Davis stood up next. He was a quiet man, but his words carried weight. "I've lived here for over a decade," he began, his tone calm but filled with conviction. "And I've seen how little things can add up, how the way we treat each other in this neighborhood shapes the kind of place this is for our kids. What happened to the Hendersons isn't just their problem. It's a reflection of what we allow to happen in our own backyards. And I, for one, am not going to stand for it anymore." More nods of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Renee could feel the sense of solidarity growing. It wasn't just lip service. People were waking up to the fact that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of complicity. A few more people stood up, offering their own thoughts, their own stories of times they had felt unwelcome or marginalized. There was a shared understanding in the room that this was about more than just one incident. It was about the kind of neighborhood they wanted to build for the future, one where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of the color of their skin or where they came from. When the floor was finally opened for discussion, Renee felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. She hadn't planned to speak, but as she watched the conversation unfold, she realized that this was her moment too. Her voice, like everyone else's, mattered. She stood slowly, and the room quieted. "I didn't expect all of this," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When we moved here, all we wanted was a safe place to raise our kids, a community we could be a part of. And for the most part, that's what we found. But as many of you know, there have been moments where we felt like outsiders in our own neighborhood. Last week wasn't the first time Mr. Johnson tried to push us out, and I doubt it will be the last. But we're not going anywhere." There was a low hum of agreement from the crowd, and Renee felt her confidence growing. What happened last week was hard. It hurt to have our celebration interrupted, to feel like we had to defend our right to be here. But what I see today, this room full of people who care about this community, who want to make it better, gives me hope. She paused, taking a breath. This isn't just about us. It's about all of us standing up for each other, making sure that no one in this neighborhood ever feels like they don't belong. We all deserve to feel safe. We all deserve to feel welcome. And I'm so grateful that we're having this conversation today. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before breaking into applause. Renee felt the warmth of the support around her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of these struggles alone. The community was standing with her, and that made all the difference. As the meeting drew to a close, plans were made for continued conversations, monthly neighborhood gatherings to keep the dialogue going, to address issues before they could fester. The sense of unity was palpable, and Renee knew that while there would still be challenges ahead, they were stronger now. Together. Later that evening, as she and James walked home, Marcus trailing behind them, Renee felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but today had shown that change was possible. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were part of something bigger. As they reached their front door, Marcus spoke up quietly. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for speaking up." Renee smiled, pulling him into a hug. "I'm proud of you too, baby. You've taught me more than you know." As the door closed behind them and the quiet of the house settled around them, Renee realized that this was just the beginning. But it was a beginning filled with hope, with determination, and with the knowledge that they were not alone, and that, more than anything, was worth celebrating. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and consider subscribing to my channel. I work hard on these stories, and your support means a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.